Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable resilience and let's say creative discomfort tolerance of the Viking people who somehow managed to survive Scandinavian winters without central heating. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Stereotypical wicked stepmother, Sarah brought warmth, books, and structure. She recognized Lincoln's intelligence and encouraged his curiosity. Between chores, he devoured everything he could get his hands on. Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, the Bible. If he couldn't get a book, he'd write his own thoughts with charcoal on wooden shingles. This boy, barefoot and bone-thin, with a face too serious for his age, was already forging something within himself. The world hadn't given him much. No money, no connections, no ease. But he had a fire inside that couldn't be smothered. And in that tiny cabin in the Kentucky woods, Abraham Lincoln began the long, improbable climb toward greatness. As Lincoln grew into his teenage years, life on the frontier didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. His family moved again. This time to the dense, swampy forests of Indiana. Every day was a battle against the elements, clearing trees, plowing thick clay soil, and surviving brutal winters with little more than a hearth fire and hope. But while his body was molded by the axe and the land, his mind remained somewhere else entirely. He became known among neighbors not for his strength, though he was impressively strong, but for his towering height and peculiar habit of reading during every spare moment. He'd carry books while walking, recite Shakespeare by memory while tending fences, and sit under trees, scribbling thoughts into the margins of whatever scrap paper he could find. His humor began to develop too. Dry, observational, often self-deprecating. He was the odd one, the gangly teen who quoted Jefferson while others traded hunting stories. Lincoln had an awkward social presence. He was shy but talkative, strange yet magnetic. When he did speak, people listened. They couldn't help it. His words were clear, powerful, sometimes funny, but always aimed straight at something true. His moral compass, even then, pointed due north. He hated cruelty. He hated slavery, and he hated the way ignorance was used to justify both. Despite his lack of formal education, Lincoln began to develop a passion for law. The idea that words, not fists, could win battles intrigued him. He taught himself how to write clearly and argue logically. He read every book of law he could find. At night, others might be drinking or gambling. Lincoln would be in a dim room reading Blackstone's commentaries by candlelight. By his early 20s, he left home for good. He worked as a flatboat man on the Mississippi River, witnessing firsthand the horrors of the slave trade in New Orleans. Those images would stay with him, seared into his conscience. When he returned, he moved to New Salem, Illinois, and began to reinvent himself. He taught himself grammar, joined the local debating society, and through sheer force of will, began the long march toward becoming a lawyer. He had no diploma, no degree, no pedigree, just a belief that knowledge was power and that it could be carved, like everything else in his life, with effort, vision, and a little bit of pain. By the time Abraham Lincoln became a lawyer, he was already a legend in central Illinois. Not because of prestige, but because of presence. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into a room and demanded attention with expensive clothes or polished charm. He was often rumpled, his trousers too short, his coat ill-fitted. But when he stood to speak, people leaned in. He had something more valuable than fashion, clarity, honesty, and relatability. Lincoln's legal career was unconventional. He didn't attend law school. He read law books borrowed from generous attorneys and passed the bar exam through self-study. Once admitted, he took to the 8th Judicial Circuit, a vast network of rural courts that he traveled by horseback, sometimes for weeks at a time. The roads were mud in the spring, dust in the summer, and ice in the winter. He slept in taverns, log cabins, and under the stars. But he loved it. What set Lincoln apart in court wasn't just his logic. It was his empathy. He could connect with jurors in a way polished lawyers never could. He'd speak plainly, paint vivid stories, and treat even the smallest farmer or poorest widow with respect. One farmer said, "He makes you feel like he's one of us, not above us." And that was the truth. Lincoln never forgot where he came from, and he never pretended to be anything he wasn't. But he wasn't soft. In court, when a case mattered, when he believed in it, he was relentless. His speeches could be slow, even awkward, but they built momentum. He'd lay facts like bricks, one after another, until the opposing side crumbled under their own contradictions. His cross-examinations were gentle traps. He'd lull witnesses into comfort, then spring a question that shattered their testimony. Over time, Lincoln became known as Honest Abe. It wasn't a campaign slogan. It was earned. He returned fees if he thought a case was unjust. He refused to represent clients who lied, and when other lawyers cut corners, he simply walked away. His reputation grew as a lawyer who understood the law and the land. But behind the scenes, another fire was smoldering: politics. The law had taught him how people worked. Now he wanted to help change the system they lived in. And as slavery crept further into the national conversation, Lincoln's quiet conscience was about to roar. Lincoln's first real foray into politics wasn't exactly meteoric. In 1832, at just 23 years old, he ran for the Illinois state legislature and lost. But failure didn't discourage him. If anything, it clarified what he needed to do: listen more, learn more, and meet people where they were. 2 years later, he tried again and won. In Springfield, the new capital, Lincoln quickly became known for his measured speeches, dry wit, and moral conviction. He didn't shout, he didn't scheme. But when he stood up in the State House and spoke, people remembered it. He wasn't interested in cheap victories or flashy slogans. His goal was deeper: understanding the machinery of law, society, and justice. Lincoln aligned himself with the Whig Party, a group that believed in modernization, infrastructure, and limiting executive power. But even as a Whig, he remained cautious about ambition. He often joked about being too ugly for politics. He read voraciously, debated energetically, but never seemed to lust for power the way other men did. If anything, politics seemed to be a burden he accepted rather than chased. During his 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, Lincoln built alliances with farmers, merchants, and other lawyers. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but often the most trusted. He developed a reputation for being principled, especially regarding slavery. Though he wasn't yet calling for abolition, he firmly opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. He called it unjust, immoral, a national hypocrisy. In 1846, Lincoln made the leap to national politics, winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. There, he took a bold and unpopular stance against the Mexican-American War, calling it unconstitutional and unnecessary. This wasn't a winning move politically. His district didn't like it. He served a single term and didn't run again. Back in Springfield, he returned to his law practice, married Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a slave-holding Kentucky family, and tried to live a quieter life. But the nation was changing rapidly. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the expansion of slavery were tearing the country apart. Lincoln might have left politics, but politics hadn't left him. The debates were growing louder, bloodier. The Union was beginning to crack, and the man once known for his caution was about to rise, not as a candidate, but as a conscience. By the 1850s, the issue of slavery no longer simmered. It boiled. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, ignited fierce violence and deeper division. Bleeding Kansas became a national symbol of chaos. For Abraham Lincoln, it was a turning point. He couldn't stay silent any longer. He returned to the political stage, not with bluster, but with moral urgency. He joined the newly formed Republican Party, a coalition of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists, all united against the expansion of slavery. Lincoln wasn't a radical abolitionist. He didn't call for immediate emancipation yet, but he believed deeply that slavery was wrong and that allowing it to spread into new states was both dangerous and unjust. In 1858, he was thrust into the national spotlight during his Senate campaign against Stephen A. Douglas, one of the most famous politicians in America. The two agreed to a series of debates across Illinois, and what followed became one of the most famous political showdowns in American history, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas defended popular sovereignty, the idea that each state should choose whether to allow slavery. Lincoln countered with clarity. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he declared. "If slavery continued to spread, it would tear the Union apart." He argued that the nation couldn't endure permanently half slave and half free. He didn't win that Senate race, but he won something greater: national attention. Newspapers reprinted his words across the country. People who had never heard of Lincoln before now whispered about the lanky lawyer from Illinois with the deep-set eyes and deeper convictions. Though he lost, he'd proven himself. He stood toe-to-toe with one of the great orators of the time and never flinched. He challenged the nation's comfort, not for personal gain, but because his conscience demanded it. Privately, Lincoln wrestled with the enormity of the issue. He once wrote that if slavery isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. But he also knew that acting too quickly could shatter the fragile Union. Still, the die was cast. The national mood was shifting, and Lincoln was rising with it. Not as a politician with easy answers, but as a voice of moral clarity in a time of moral fog. By 1860, America stood on the edge of a knife. Sectional tensions had reached a breaking point. Slavery wasn't just a moral debate anymore. It was a political firestorm. Southern states threatened secession, and the Republican Party was scrambling to find a leader who could unite the North without sparking immediate war. That unlikely figure turned out to be Abraham Lincoln. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, he was not the front runner. In fact, most expected the nomination to go to Senator William Seward of New York, a polished statesman with decades of political experience. But Lincoln had something the others didn't: a clean reputation, a moderate tone, and powerful momentum from his debates with Douglas. His team campaigned hard behind the scenes, emphasizing his frontier roots and personal honesty. Lincoln was portrayed as the self-made man, the rail splitter who rose from nothing. His humble beginnings weren't a liability. They were a symbol of American potential. By the third ballot, he secured the nomination, and the political world blinked in surprise. The general election was bitter and fractured. The Democratic Party split in two, with Northern and Southern factions backing different candidates. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on most Southern ballots. But in the North and West, he carried immense support. On November 6, 1860, he was elected the 16th President of the United States, with just 40% of the popular vote, but a decisive electoral majority. He didn't celebrate. In fact, the mood was grim. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to secede. 6 more Southern states followed before Lincoln even took office. The country was unraveling faster than anyone expected. As he prepared to travel from Springfield to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration, Lincoln received death threats daily. Some warned he wouldn't survive the journey. Security was so tight that he had to sneak into the Capitol by train under the cover of night, disguised and unannounced. This was not the triumphant arrival of a conqueror. It was the reluctant entrance of a president-elect whose election had cracked the Union. When Lincoln finally took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, he faced a country divided, angry, and armed. And yet, in his address, he reached not for vengeance, but for peace. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "We must not be enemies." But the winds of war were already howling at the door. Barely a month after Abraham Lincoln took office, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. What followed was the bloodiest conflict in American history. A brutal test not just of military might, but of Lincoln's character, leadership, and resolve. Lincoln had no military background. He had briefly served as a captain in the Black Hawk War, but had never seen combat. Now he was commander-in-chief of a nation at war with itself. He spent long nights in the War Department reading telegrams, studying maps, and learning strategy on the fly. He read books on warfare, questioned his generals, and obsessed over troop movements. He wasn't a warrior by nature, but he became one by necessity. His early presidency was marked by frustration. General after general disappointed him. George McClellan in particular had the loyalty of the troops, but the caution of a man afraid to fight. Lincoln, exasperated by delays and excuses, once asked, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a while." But Lincoln's real genius wasn't just in battlefield decisions, it was in vision. He understood that this war wasn't just about states' rights or secession. It was about the very soul of the nation. Could a country built on liberty survive half enslaved? At first, Lincoln moved cautiously on slavery, fearing that aggressive abolition would push border states into the Confederacy. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, his thinking evolved. The moral issue and the military one became inseparable. Slavery, he concluded, was the engine of the Confederate economy and morale. If it wasn't destroyed, the rebellion would never die. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate-held territories free. It didn't free everyone overnight, but it changed everything. The war was no longer just a fight to preserve the Union. It was a fight for human freedom. Internationally, it closed the door on British or French support for the Confederacy. Domestically, it gave black men the moral and legal justification to join the Union Army, which thousands did, fighting for a country that had long denied them citizenship. Lincoln had transformed from the log cabin lawyer into a wartime president, wielding not only authority, but moral thunder. As the war dragged into its fourth year, Lincoln bore its burden alone at the top, thinner, grayer, and visibly aged. Every day brought fresh casualty lists. Towns became graveyards. He received letters from grieving mothers and wives, each demanding to know why their sons and husbands had died. And though he never fought on a battlefield, Lincoln carried the war in his eyes and on his shoulders. His cabinet was a mix of political rivals, men who once ran against him and didn't always respect him. But Lincoln managed them like a maestro, balancing ambition with purpose. He didn't rule by fear or force. He ruled with patience, stories, and clarity. Even his critics began to admit the man had steel beneath the smile. And then came Gettysburg. The battle in July 1863 was a turning point. Over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in 3 days of horror. Months later, Lincoln traveled to Pennsylvania to deliver a short speech at the new cemetery. It wasn't meant to be headline-making, just a few words of reflection. But in just 272 words, he rewrote the purpose of the war. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address wasn't grandiose. It was restrained, reverent, and eternal. And it made clear that this war wasn't just about unity. It was about redemption, remaking the nation into what it had always claimed to be. As the 1864 presidential election loomed, Lincoln faced deep opposition. The war was still raging, and his support was crumbling. Even within his own party, there were calls to replace him on the ticket. Many believed he'd lose to Democrat George McClellan, the very general he had fired. But as Union victories mounted late that year, especially General Sherman's capture of Atlanta, momentum swung back in Lincoln's favor. He was re-elected with a decisive margin. Still, Lincoln didn't gloat. "It is not in my nature to triumph over anyone," he said. The war was nearly won, but Lincoln knew peace would be harder. The Union could be rebuilt with muskets, but the nation's soul, that would take something much deeper. Mercy, vision, and healing. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Cities fell one after another. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was burning. General Robert E. Lee's army was running out of supplies, soldiers, and time. And yet, Lincoln showed no joy. Victory for him was never about punishment. It was about restoration. In his second inaugural address delivered on March 4, 1865, Lincoln spoke not as a conqueror, but as a moral philosopher. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. These were not the words of a politician looking to crush his enemies. They were the words of a father trying to save his broken family. On April 9th, Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant at Appomattox's courthouse. The war was over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery through the ratification of the 13th Amendment had been abolished. For the first time in centuries, the nation took a trembling step toward the ideals it had professed in 1776. But just as the country exhaled, tragedy struck. Only 5 days after the surrender, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. In the middle of the performance, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth crept into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. He died the next morning, April 15, 1865. The nation mourned like never before. Black Americans, many newly freed, wept in the streets. Former enemies, even in the South, acknowledged the depth of the loss. He had been their best hope for reconciliation, a man who never saw politics as war and never let hatred take root in his heart. Lincoln didn't live to see Reconstruction or to heal the wounds his presidency had helped expose. But his death transformed him from a leader into a symbol of freedom, unity, and the painful price of moral progress. From the dirt floor of a Kentucky cabin to the highest office in the land, Abraham Lincoln rose without money, without privilege, and without cruelty. He led a nation through its darkest hour, not with blinding brilliance, but with steady, stubborn light. And that light dimmed by an assassin's bullet still burns in the story of America. When we imagine the ancient world, we usually think of mighty empires, glittering temples, and epic battles. What we rarely consider is how these people pooped. Yet sanitation, or the lack of it, shaped daily life as much as any king or war. Behind every marble palace or clay brick home, someone had to deal with the mess. And in a time without flush buttons or scented sprays, that was a far more public and pungent affair than we like to admit. Toilets in the ancient world weren't just about comfort. They were about survival. Human waste carries disease, and when it's poorly managed, as it often was, entire communities suffered. Dysentery, cholera, and parasitic infections were frequent, invisible killers. In cities without sanitation, waste flowed through the streets, soaked into wells, and clung to sandals. But in places that took sanitation seriously, something remarkable happened. Life expectancy rose, plagues lessened, and urban centers flourished. Surprisingly, some of the world's oldest civilizations developed systems that wouldn't look entirely out of place today. The Indus Valley cities had street-wide drainage and brick toilets. The Minoans built ceramic pipes and flushing mechanisms. The Romans, they practically turned waste management into an art form. And while other societies like the Vikings or early Chinese dynasties handled things a bit more rustically, even they had methods that reflected cultural ideas about health, modesty, and the natural world. But let's be clear, ancient toilets were not always private, not always clean, and certainly not dignified. Communal latrines were often the norm, especially in military camps or urban centers. Picture 20 stone holes in a row, no dividers, everyone seated elbow to elbow, gossiping or arguing while doing their business. Sponges on sticks were passed around. Water was used to rinse, not always to flush. And beneath it all, quite literally, were the earliest forms of sewers, cesspits, and sometimes just plain open ditches. Sanitation was a mirror of a society's values. Where it was neglected, chaos followed. Where it was engineered, civilization bloomed. And if you're brave enough to look past the filth, you'll discover a hidden history. One where pipes, pits, and poop tell us more about ancient life than monuments ever could. Long before the Romans laid down aqueducts or the Greeks dreamed of public baths, the people of the Indus Valley were already solving one of civilization's dirtiest problems: sanitation. Dating back to around 2600 BCE, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, located in what is now modern-day Pakistan, were surprisingly advanced in their urban planning, particularly when it came to managing human waste. At first glance, the remains of these ancient cities might seem like nothing more than dusty ruins. But look closer, and you'll find a highly organized network of brick-lined streets with standardized measurements and most impressively covered drainage systems running alongside them. Yes, while much of the world was still digging holes in the ground, the Indies people had figured out how to keep their cities flowing and their homes clean. Each house, even modest ones, had a small room designated for washing, often featuring a squat-style toilet or bathing area connected to a vertical chute. This chute funneled waste into a covered brick drain outside, which then joined larger public sewers. These were not rudimentary ditches. They were engineered with inspection holes, gradients, and even brick baffles to catch solids. Some scholars suggest that waste from wealthier homes was flushed using jars of water, gravity doing the rest. And the genius didn't stop at toilets. The Indus system also separated stormwater from waste. Public wells dotted the streets. And while we can't say for sure how water safety was ensured, the very presence of sanitation infrastructure implies a high regard for public health, rare for its time. But perhaps most stunning of all, the lack of palaces or temples in these cities. The Indus people were apparently more concerned with equality and urban function than divine monuments, and their toilet systems reflect that. Practical, widespread, and surprisingly democratic. Sadly, much about the Indus civilization remains mysterious. Their writing system is still undeciphered, and we don't know exactly why their cities eventually declined. But their toilets, the silent brick channels buried beneath their feet, still speak volumes. In an age when many empires ruled through spectacle, the Indies chose something quieter, cleaner, and arguably more civilized. While the Indus Valley engineered underground sewers, the ancient Egyptians approached sanitation with a different lens, one steeped in ritual status and a deeply held belief in physical and spiritual purity. For them, cleanliness wasn't just about avoiding disease, it was a form of worship. In the Nile-fed civilization of ancient Egypt, bathing was an essential daily routine, especially for the wealthy. Homes of the elite often featured small limestone basins or bathing rooms where servants would pour water for washing. Oils, natron, a natural salt, and perfumed ointments were commonly used, and hair removal was routine. But when it came to toilets, things got a little more practical. Toilets in ancient Egypt ranged from simple pits lined with sand to more refined limestone or wooden seats placed above ceramic pots. These pots were emptied by servants or slaves and dumped far from living quarters, ideally into the desert. In wealthier homes, these seats might be tucked away in private quarters, hinting at the growing association between sanitation and status. Public sanitation, however, was virtually non-existent. Streets in cities like Thebes or Memphis were often soiled, and while waste was sometimes used as fertilizer in rural areas, it wasn't always managed responsibly in urban centers. Instead, the focus remained on personal cleanliness. Priests, for example, were required to bathe multiple times a day, shave their bodies, and avoid impurities. They couldn't enter temples without ritual washing, which sometimes included enemas, not for health reasons, but as spiritual preparation. Interestingly, tombs of pharaohs and nobles occasionally included toilet stools among their grave goods. It seems the ancient Egyptians expected that even in the afterlife, one would still need to do their business and do it with dignity. The Egyptians also made early attempts at pest control. Amulets, spells, and ointments were used to ward off flies and other carriers of disease. In this way, cleanliness straddled the physical and the mystical. In short, while Egypt didn't develop large-scale sewer systems, it pioneered a cultural emphasis on hygiene. Their obsession with purity influenced medicine, religion, and daily life. And though their toilets may have been simple, their ideas about cleanliness were anything but. While most of Bronze Age Europe was squatting over pits, the Minoans of Crete were flushing. Yes, flushing. Over 3,500 years ago, the Minoan civilization, which flourished from roughly 2000 to 400 BCE, developed one of the most sophisticated plumbing systems in the ancient world. Their capital at Knossos wasn't just home to labyrinth myths and fresco. It also had multi-story buildings with running water and working toilets. The Minoans understood something that many civilizations wouldn't figure out for centuries: gravity and water pressure. Their palaces had terracotta pipes laid beneath the floors and inside walls, channeling rainwater and spring water into fountains, baths, and perhaps most notably, latrines. In the Queen's Megaron of Knos, archaeologists discovered what may be the oldest known flush toilet, a wooden seat set over a stone basin connected to a vertical pipe which could be flushed with water manually poured from a vessel. Bathing was also a high priority. The Minoans constructed large ceramic bathtubs, not unlike those found in modern homes. Water could be supplied from rooftop tanks or aqueducts and drained through underground channels. The use of U-shaped water traps to block odor, a precursor to the modern plumbing trap, has even been proposed, though this remains debated. What's particularly striking is the integration of these systems into elite homes, suggesting that comfort and cleanliness were signs of prestige. Unlike later Roman latrines, which were public and communal, Minoan sanitation leaned private. Your toilet was in your own home, a luxury even many 19th century Europeans didn't have. The Minoans weren't just practical, they were stylish about it. Their bathrooms were decorated with colorful fresco and elegant plasterwork. Sanitation, it seems, could be both functional and fashionable. Unfortunately, the fall of the Minoan civilization around 1450 BCE, possibly due to volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, or invasions, led to the loss of these innovations. It would take over 1,000 years for similar toilet technology to re-emerge in other parts of the Mediterranean. Still, the ruins of Knos whisper a simple truth. The desire to stay clean, flush away waste, and bathe in privacy isn't a modern obsession. It's ancient, deeply human, and in the case of the Minoans, impressively advanced. When it comes to ancient sanitation, no civilization made a bigger, bolder statement than the Romans. By the height of the Roman Empire, they had mastered the art of infrastructure, aqueducts, roads, and yes, toilets. For the Romans, sanitation wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about civilization itself. And that meant making toilets public, efficient, and surprisingly, social. Walk into any major Roman city from Pompeii to Londinium, and you'd likely find public latrines, open rooms with long stone benches, each carved with evenly spaced holes. No stalls, no dividers, just elbow-to-elbow seating. Beneath the benches ran a steady stream of water to carry away waste, and a secondary channel held sponge sticks to the Roman answer to toilet paper. These sponges were rinsed communally in water and vinegar, then reused. Hygienic? Not quite. Functional? Very. For the Romans, using the toilet wasn't a private ordeal. It was a social event. People chatted, gossiped, conducted business, all while taking care of nature's call. Latrines were often decorated with mosaics or inscriptions, some of them humorous or even crude. Graffiti inside Pompeii's latrines includes complaints about bad smells, poor plumbing, and even, of course, rude users. But Roman sanitation extended far beyond toilets. Their cities were crisscrossed with cloaca, enormous sewer systems, the most famous being the Cloaca Maxima in Rome. Built initially to drain marshes, it became the backbone of Rome's waste management system. Rainwater, urine, and feces all flowed through it, fed by aqueducts that brought in fresh water from miles away. In private homes, wealthier Romans had indoor latrines that emptied into cesspits or directly into the sewers. The poor relied on chamber pots, which were sometimes dumped from windows into the street despite laws forbidding it. Apartment dwellers, especially in insula, multi-story tenements, suffered the worst. Many buildings lacked plumbing entirely, and the lower floors often flooded with sewage. Interestingly, Romans taxed urine. Emperor Vespasian even instituted a pee tax on public urinals, a move so infamous that his name is still associated with urinals in France and Italy today. In short, Roman toilets weren't just advanced. They were loud, crowded, political, and strangely progressive, offering perhaps the first large-scale attempt at truly communal sanitation. While the Romans embraced public defecation like a community picnic, the ancient Greeks took a more modest approach. To them, bodily functions were personal, something to be handled quietly, discreetly, and preferably alone. That said, they still made significant contributions to sanitation and cleanliness, just in a very different tone.